The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise as Sarah Martinez adjusted her utility belt and checked her watch. 5:30 a.m. came early, but she had learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the carrier erupted into its daily symphony of controlled chaos. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a reminder of how far she was from the small Texas town where she grew up. Sarah made her way down to the ammunition storage compartment, her boots echoing against the metal deck plates. At 24, she had been in the Navy for 6 years, and handling ordnance had become second nature to her. The other sailors respected her expertise, though they knew little about her past. She preferred it that way. The ammunition bay was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. Petty Officer Williams nodded at her as she grabbed her clipboard and began inspecting the morning's work orders. Today would be busy. They were expecting delivery of several thousand rounds of various calibers, and everything needed to be cataloged, inspected, and properly stowed before the afternoon flight operations began. "Martinez, you're on inventory duty," called out Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez from across the compartment. "We've got a new shipment of 20mm rounds coming up from storage, and I need them counted and logged before Euro 800. Sarah nodded and moved toward the designated area where crates were already being wheeled in by the supply team. As she worked, carefully counting and recording each box of ammunition, she found herself lost in the familiar rhythm of the task. Count, mark, stack, repeat. It was methodical work that allowed her mind to wander, though she was always careful to never let it wander too far into certain territories of her past. The metal was cool against her chest as she bent over to lift another crate. Beneath her uniform shirt, hidden from view, hung a medal on a simple chain. She had worn it every day for the past 3 years, but nobody on the ship knew it existed. The bronze star with Valor device was supposed to be worn with pride, displayed on dress uniforms during ceremonies and special occasions. Instead, Sarah kept it pressed against her heart like a secret shame. As the morning progressed, more sailors filtered into the ammunition bay to begin their shifts. Sarah worked alongside them, lifting, stacking, and organizing with the efficiency that had earned her recognition as one of the most reliable ordnance handlers on the ship. But even as she joked with her shipmates and focused on her duties, a part of her mind remained forever locked in a desert compound half a world away. The memory always started the same way, the sound of incoming mortar rounds whistling through the air above the fire base where she had been stationed during her previous deployment. She had been an ammunition specialist then, too, responsible for ensuring that the Marines had everything they needed to defend their position. When the attack came, she had done what her training taught her. She had done what needed to be done to keep her fellow service members alive. But surviving that night had cost her more than she ever imagined it would. "Hey, Martinez." "You okay over there?" called out Seaman Johnson, one of the younger sailors who had recently reported aboard. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah forced a smile and wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Just thinking about how much ammunition we're going to have to move today," she replied, deflecting the concern with practiced ease. "Better pace yourself, Johnson. It's going to be a long one." The work continued throughout the morning, with Sarah methodically processing each shipment that arrived. She had developed a reputation for being thorough and accurate, never making mistakes that could potentially compromise the safety of flight operations. Her attention to detail was legendary among the ordnance crew, though they attributed it simply to professional pride rather than understanding the deeper reasons behind her perfectionism. Around noon, as the lunch rotation began and the compartment temporarily quieted down, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time all day. She sat on a crate of flare cartridges and allowed herself a moment to rest. The metal felt heavier than usual against her chest, its weight a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. She remembered the ceremony where it had been presented to her, The colonel had spoken about valor and sacrifice, about going above and beyond the call of duty in the face of enemy fire. The words had felt hollow, even as they were being spoken, because Sarah knew the truth about that night. She hadn't been brave, she had been terrified. Every decision she made had been driven by fear, not courage. Fear for her own life, fear for the lives of the Marines depending on her, fear of letting everyone down. The medal had been intended to honor her actions, but to Sarah, it felt more like evidence of her failures. She thought about the 3 Marines who hadn't made it home, despite everything she had done. She thought about the families who had lost sons and fathers while she received recognition for simply doing her job. The guilt had followed her from that desert base to her new assignment on the carrier, a constant companion that she couldn't shake. When Chief Rodriguez returned from lunch, he found Sarah exactly where he had left her, working steadily through the inventory checklist. He had been her supervisor for 8 months now, and while he appreciated her work ethic, he sometimes worried about her tendency to isolate herself from the rest of the crew. Good sailors needed camaraderie as much as they needed technical skills, and Sarah seemed to keep everyone at arm's length. "Martinez, why don't you take a break and grab some chow?" he suggested. "You've been at this for 6 hours straight." "I'm almost finished with this section, Chief," Sarah replied without looking up from her clipboard. "I'd rather just push through and get it done." Rodriguez frowned but didn't press the issue. He had learned that Sarah would work herself to exhaustion if allowed, and while her dedication was admirable, it wasn't healthy. He made a mental note to speak with her about taking better care of herself when they had some privacy. As the afternoon wore on, the ammunition bay became increasingly busy as flight operations prepared to commence. Sarah coordinated with the flight deck crew to ensure that the proper ordnance was available for each mission, double-checking serial numbers and specifications with the meticulousness that had become her trademark. Every round of ammunition that left the storage compartment passed through her hands, and she took that responsibility seriously. The work was physically demanding, requiring her to lift heavy boxes and maneuver them into position for transport to the flight deck. But Sarah had always been strong, and the physical exertion helped keep her mind focused on the present, rather than allowing it to drift back to memories she preferred to keep buried. Sweat soaked through her utility shirt as the day progressed, but she never complained or asked for assistance unless absolutely necessary. As evening approached and the day shift began to wind down, Sarah found herself thinking about the letter she had received from her mother the previous week. Her family still believed she was just another sailor serving her country with honor, proud of their daughter who had chosen to make the military her career. They had no idea about the medal she carried or the circumstances that had led to her receiving it. Sarah had decided long ago that some burdens were meant to be carried alone. The truth was that she had volunteered for the carrier assignment specifically to escape the memories that haunted her at her previous duty station. Being at sea, surrounded by nothing but endless ocean, felt like a form of exile that she had imposed upon herself. Here, she could lose herself in the routine of shipboard life and convince herself that she was starting fresh, even though the weight of the medal against her chest reminded her daily that the past could never truly be left behind. When Chief Rodriguez dismissed the day shift, Sarah lingered in the ammunition bay, ostensibly to complete some final paperwork, but really because she wasn't ready to return to her berthing compartment. The small space she shared with 3 other female sailors felt claustrophobic at the best of times, but in the evenings, when conversation inevitably turned to home and family and future plans, it became almost unbearable. Instead, she climbed the ladders to an observation deck where she could watch the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and gold. The carrier cut through the water with purposeful grace, its massive bulk somehow elegant despite its size. Sarah had come to love the ocean during her time aboard the ship, finding peace in its vastness and indifference to human concerns. As she stood at the rail, the wind whipping through her hair, Sarah allowed herself to think about the 3 Marines who had died that night in the desert. She whispered their names into the wind: Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim, young men who had trusted her expertise and died anyway. The medal she wore was supposed to honor their sacrifice as much as her own actions, but it felt more like a burden than a tribute. The sound of footsteps behind her interrupted her reverie, and she turned to see Admiral Harrison approaching the rail. Sarah immediately straightened to attention. Surprised to see such a high-ranking officer in this relatively remote part of the ship during off-duty hours. "As you were, petty officer," the Admiral said, moving to stand beside her at the rail. "Beautiful sunset tonight." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, though she remained at a modified position of attention despite his informal tone. Admiral Harrison was known throughout the fleet as a sailor's officer, someone who had worked his way up through the ranks and understood the challenges faced by enlisted personnel. He had been observing Sarah's work for several weeks now, impressed by her dedication and professionalism, but also concerned by what seemed to be an underlying sadness that she carried with her everywhere she went. "I understand you've been doing exceptional work in ordnance," the Admiral said, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Chief Rodriguez speaks very highly of your attention to detail and work ethic." "Thank you, sir. I try to do my job to the best of my ability," Sarah responded, uncomfortable with the praise, but unwilling to appear dismissive of a senior officer's comments. "How long have you been in the Navy, Martinez?" the Admiral asked, though he already knew the answer from her service record. 6 years, sir. This is my 2nd deployment." The Admiral nodded, noting the slight tension in her voice when she mentioned her previous deployment. He had learned to read sailors over the course of his 30-year career, and something about Martinez suggested there was more to her story than what appeared in her official records. As they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear below the horizon, Sarah felt the metal shift slightly beneath her shirt. For a moment, she was tempted to tell the Admiral about it, to finally share the burden she had been carrying alone for so long. But the moment passed, and she remained silent, just another sailor watching the sunset from the deck of a carrier in the middle of the ocean. The Admiral eventually excused himself, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts once again. As she made her way back to her berthing compartment, she resolved to continue keeping her secret hidden. The medal would remain beneath her uniform, a private reminder of a night she could never forget and a recognition she felt she didn't deserve. Tomorrow would bring another day of stacking ammunition, counting inventory, and losing herself in the routine of military life. And for now, that was enough. The medal could stay hidden, along with the memories it represented and the guilt it symbolized. Sarah had convinced herself that some things were better left buried, not realizing that truth, like the vast ocean surrounding their ship, had a way of eventually rising to the surface no matter how deeply it was hidden. 3 weeks had passed since Admiral Harrison's conversation with Sarah on the observation deck, but the encounter had stayed with him longer than he anticipated. There was something about the young sailor that reminded him of other service members he had encountered over the years, those who carried invisible wounds that were often harder to heal than physical injuries. He had made a point of observing her work more closely, and what he saw both impressed and concerned him. Sarah's dedication to her duties remained unwavering. Every morning she arrived early to the ammunition storage compartment, and every evening she was among the last to leave. Her attention to detail was meticulous to the point of being excessive, double and triple-checking work that other sailors would have considered complete after a single inspection. Chief Rodriguez had mentioned in passing that Martinez seemed to take on additional responsibilities without being asked, as if she was trying to prove something to herself as much as to her superiors. On this particular morning, the carrier was conducting a major resupply operation, A logistics ship had pulled alongside during the night, and the crew was working around the clock to transfer supplies, including several tons of various ammunition types that would need to be processed, cataloged, and stored. Sarah had volunteered for the early shift, arriving at 0400 to begin preparations for what would be the largest single ammunition transfer the ship had handled in months. The work was more physically demanding than usual, requiring the ordnance team to form human chains to move the heavier crates from the receiving area to their designated storage compartments. Sarah positioned herself at one of the more challenging stations, handling the transfer of artillery shells that weighed nearly 50 pounds each. Despite her relatively small frame, she moved the heavy ordnance with practiced efficiency, her face set in concentration as she maintained the steady rhythm required to keep the supply chain moving smoothly. Admiral Harrison had decided to personally observe the resupply operation, both to ensure everything proceeded safely and to demonstrate to the crew that senior leadership was invested in their success. As he made his rounds through the ship, checking on various departments involved in the transfer, he inevitably found himself in the ammunition storage compartment where Sarah and her team were working. The compartment was crowded with sailors moving in coordinated precision, their movements choreographed by years of training and experience. The Admiral watched from an elevated platform as the team processed crate after crate of ammunition, noting the smooth efficiency of their operation. His attention was drawn particularly to Sarah, who seemed to be everywhere at once, ensuring that each piece of ordnance was properly handled and documented. As the morning wore on, the temperature in the compartment began to rise significantly. The combination of body heat from dozens of working sailors, the lack of adequate ventilation, and the physical exertion required for the heavy lifting created an almost suffocating atmosphere. Most of the crew had rolled up their sleeves or unbuttoned the top portions of their utility shirts to deal with the heat. But Sarah continued working in her fully buttoned uniform, despite the obvious discomfort. Chief Rodriguez noticed her condition first. Sarah's face was flushed red from the heat, and sweat was pouring down her forehead despite her efforts to wipe it away. Her movements, while still precise, had begun to slow as her body struggled to cope with the rising temperature. "Martinez, unbutton that shirt before you pass out," Rodriguez called out, concern evident in his voice. "Nobody's going to write you up for being out of uniform when it's this hot down here." Sarah shook her head without looking up from the crate she was inspecting. "I'm fine, Chief. Just need to push through this batch and then I'll take a water break." But even as she spoke, her hands began to tremble slightly as she lifted the next shell. The combination of heat, physical exertion, and her refusal to loosen her clothing was clearly taking its toll. Several of the other sailors had begun to notice her condition, and whispers of concern rippled through the work party. Admiral Harrison observed the scene with growing alarm. He had seen heat exhaustion before, and Sarah was displaying classic symptoms. More concerning was her stubborn refusal to take even basic steps to cool down, suggesting that whatever was keeping her uniform buttoned was more important to her than her own physical well-being. The crisis came suddenly. Sarah was in the process of lifting a particularly heavy crate when her legs buckled beneath her. The ammunition container slipped from her grasp, and while it landed safely on the deck without causing any damage, Sarah herself collapsed to her knees, her face pale and her breathing rapid and shallow. "Medical emergency and ammunition storage," Chief Rodriguez shouted into his radio as he rushed to Sarah's side. "Heat exhaustion. Need corpsman immediately." The Admiral descended from his observation platform and quickly assessed the situation. Sarah was conscious but clearly in distress, her body temperature dangerously elevated and her pulse racing. Without hesitation, he began giving orders to clear space around her and provide immediate first aid. "Get some cold water and towels," he commanded. "And somebody open those access panels to get some air circulation in here." As the medical team arrived and began their assessment, it became clear that Sarah's condition was serious enough to require immediate intervention. The ship's corpsman quickly determined that she needed to be moved to a cooler environment and have her body temperature reduced as quickly as possible. "We need to get these clothes loosened up to help her cool down," announced Hospital Corpsman Second Class Williams as he prepared to assist Sarah. The heat's trapped against her body. Sarah's eyes widened in panic, and despite her weakened condition, she grabbed at her shirt to prevent anyone from unbuttoning it. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, just leave it alone." The corpsman looked confused by her resistance. In cases of heat exhaustion, removing excess clothing was standard protocol, and her insistence on keeping her uniform fully buttoned could potentially worsen her condition. He looked to Chief Rodriguez and then to Admiral Harrison for guidance. "Martinez, we need to help you cool down," the Admiral said gently, kneeling beside her. "The corpsman needs to do his job." "I can't," Sarah replied, tears beginning to mix with the sweat on her face. "You don't understand. I can't let you see." Admiral Harrison had encountered this type of situation before. Service members who had been injured in combat sometimes bore scars they preferred to keep hidden, either from shame or from a desire to maintain their privacy. He signaled for the corpsman to step back momentarily while he addressed Sarah directly. "Sailor, whatever you're worried about seeing, I guarantee you that everyone in this room has seen worse," he said quietly. "We're all here to help you, not to judge you. Your health is more important than anything else right now." Sarah closed her eyes, the internal struggle evident on her face. The rational part of her mind knew that the Admiral was right. Her physical condition was deteriorating, and she needed immediate medical attention. But the thought of exposing the metal she had kept hidden for so long felt like a betrayal of everything she had convinced herself was necessary. Finally, exhaustion and heat overcame her resistance. Her grip on her shirt loosened, and she nodded weakly to indicate that the medical team could proceed. Hospital Corpsman Williams quickly began unbuttoning her uniform shirt, while Admiral Harrison positioned himself to provide privacy screening from the other sailors in the compartment. As the shirt was opened to allow air circulation against Sarah's overheated skin, the Bronze Star medal became visible for the first time since she had boarded the carrier. It hung from a simple chain around her neck, the distinctive bronze color and star design immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with military decorations. The medal itself was accompanied by a small V device, indicating that it had been awarded for valor in combat. Admiral Harrison's expression immediately changed from concern to surprise, then to something approaching understanding. He had been in the military long enough to recognize not just what the medal represented, but also what it might mean for a sailor to be hiding it rather than wearing it with pride. His eyes met Sarah's, and in that moment, both of them realized that a conversation was inevitable. "Continue with the medical treatment," the Admiral instructed the corpsman quietly. "I want her moved to sickbay immediately and monitored until her condition stabilizes." As the medical team prepared to transport Sarah to the ship's medical facility, Admiral Harrison made a decision that would change both of their lives. Instead of allowing the incident to be processed as a routine case of heat exhaustion, he decided that he needed to understand why one of his sailors was hiding a medal that should have been a source of pride. Over the next 2 hours, as Sarah recovered in the air-conditioned environment of the sickbay, Admiral Harrison reviewed her service record more thoroughly than he had before. What he found was a career marked by consistently excellent performance evaluations, several commendations for technical expertise, and a gap in her record that corresponded to a deployment in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. The Bronze Star Award was not mentioned anywhere in her current service jacket, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes awards processed through different command structures took time to appear in a sailor's permanent record, particularly if they had been earned while serving in joint operations with other service branches. More telling was what Admiral Harrison found when he contacted the personnel office for additional information about Sarah's previous deployment. The records indicated that she had served as an ammunition specialist at a forward operating base that had come under intense enemy fire, and that she had been recommended for decoration by a Marine colonel for her actions during the attack. But the most revealing information came from an unofficial conversation with an old colleague who had served in the same theater around the same time. Admiral Harrison learned that Sarah's forward operating base had been overrun during a coordinated enemy assault, and that several service members had been killed despite the best efforts of those defending the position. As he processed this information, Admiral Harrison began to understand why Sarah might be carrying her medal as a burden rather than wearing it as an honor. He had seen similar cases before, service members who survived combat situations where others didn't, and who struggled with survivors' guilt and questions about whether they deserved recognition for simply doing their jobs while their comrades paid the ultimate price. When the medical team cleared Sarah to return to duty later that afternoon, Admiral Harrison was waiting for her outside the sick bay. He had spent considerable time thinking about how to approach the conversation he knew they needed to have, and he had decided that directness tempered with compassion would be the most effective approach. "How are you feeling, Petty Officer Martinez?" he asked as she emerged from the medical facility. "Much better, sir. Thank you for your concern," Sarah replied, though she couldn't meet his eyes directly. "Walk with me," the Admiral said simply, leading her toward a quiet section of the ship where they could speak privately. They walked in silence for several minutes, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the metal deck plates as they made their way through the ship's corridors. Sarah knew that the conversation she had been avoiding for 3 years was finally about to happen, and despite her dread, she also felt a strange sense of relief. Admiral Harrison led her to his personal cabin, a space that reflected his decades of naval service with photographs, commendations, and mementos from his various assignments around the world. He gestured for Sarah to take a seat while he settled behind his desk, his expression serious but not unkind. "I saw your medal today," he said without preamble. "Bronze Star with Valor device. That's not something that gets awarded lightly." Sarah nodded but remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I also did some research into your previous deployment," the Admiral continued. "Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. Marine Colonel Stevens recommended you for the award after an enemy assault on your position." At the mention of Colonel Stevens's name, Sarah's composure finally cracked. Tears began to flow down her cheeks as 3 years of suppressed emotion finally found an outlet. The Admiral waited patiently, understanding that sometimes the most important conversations required time to develop naturally. "He said I was a hero," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But 3 Marines died that night. Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim. They died while I lived, and somehow that made me deserving of a medal." Admiral Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression gentle but firm. "Tell me what happened that night, Sarah. Tell me why you've been carrying that medal like a burden instead of wearing it with pride." And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah began to speak about the night that had changed her life forever. The words came slowly at first, then in a flood as she finally allowed herself to confront the memories she had been trying so hard to forget. The Admiral listened without interruption, understanding that sometimes healing required nothing more than a willingness to listen and to witness another person's pain without judgment. As Sarah's story unfolded, Admiral Harrison began to understand not just what had happened that night in Afghanistan, but why she had been punishing herself ever since. The conversation would continue long into the evening, marking the beginning of a process that would eventually allow Sarah to find peace with her past and pride in her service. The story Sarah told Admiral Harrison that evening was one of survival, sacrifice, and the heavy burden of being alive when others were not. She described the night at Forward Operating Base Chapman with vivid detail that had been burned into her memory. The sound of incoming mortar rounds, the acrid smell of gunpowder and smoke, and the desperate scramble to keep ammunition flowing to the Marines defending their position against an overwhelming enemy assault. Sarah explained how she had been responsible for the ammunition supply point, working through the night to ensure that every fighting position had what they needed to hold their ground. When the enemy broke through the perimeter in 3 separate locations, she had left the relative safety of her bunker to personally deliver ammunition to the most threatened positions, running across open ground under heavy fire multiple times throughout the 8-hour battle. But what haunted her most wasn't her own actions. It was the moment when Corporal Rodriguez had asked her to help evacuate wounded Marines from an exposed position. She had been carrying ammunition to another section of the base when she heard his call for assistance over the radio. By the time she reached his position, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim were already dead, killed by a mortar round that had landed just seconds before her arrival. "I was maybe 50 meters away when it happened," Sarah told the Admiral, her voice breaking as she relived the memory. "If I had been faster, if I had dropped the ammunition and run to help them immediately instead of trying to complete my delivery first, maybe they would still be alive. Maybe I could have gotten them out of there before the mortar hit." Admiral Harrison listened without interruption as Sarah continued her story, describing how she had spent the remaining hours of the battle tormented by the thought that her decision to prioritize ammunition delivery over immediate medical assistance had cost 3 young Marines their lives. Even though the base had successfully held off the enemy assault, and even though her actions had undoubtedly saved many other lives by keeping the defenders supplied with ammunition, Sarah could only focus on the 3 men who hadn't made it home. "The colonel called me a hero," she continued, wiping tears from her eyes. "He said I had shown exceptional courage and that my actions had been instrumental in saving the base. But all I could think about was Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim, and how their families would never see them again while I got to go home with a medal pinned to my chest." As Sarah's story concluded, Admiral Harrison began to understand the complex emotions that had led her to hide her Bronze Star. He had seen similar cases throughout his career. Service members who survived traumatic combat experiences often struggled with survivor's guilt, questioning whether they deserved to be honored when others had made the ultimate sacrifice. "Sarah," he said quietly, using her first name for the first time, "let me ask you something. If you had been in Corporal Rodriguez's position that night, and if he had been the one carrying ammunition across the base, would you have wanted him to abandon his critical mission to try to save you?" Sarah looked up, surprised by the question. She had never considered the situation from that perspective. "Of course not, sir. The ammunition was needed to keep the entire base from being overrun. If he had abandoned that mission, a lot more people might have died." "Then why do you think Rodriguez would have wanted anything different from you?" the Admiral asked gently. "You were a soldier doing your job in an impossible situation. You made the decision that gave the most people the best chance of survival. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's exactly what leadership and courage look like under fire." Over the following weeks, Admiral Harrison made it his personal mission to help Sarah work through the trauma and guilt she had been carrying. He arranged for her to speak with the ship's chaplain, who had experience counseling service members dealing with combat-related stress. He also connected her with a Navy psychologist who specialized in helping veterans process difficult combat experiences. But perhaps most importantly, he helped Sarah understand that her medal wasn't just recognition for her individual actions. It was a tribute to the courage and sacrifice of all the service members who had been at Forward Operating Base Chapman that night, including Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim. The medal honored their memory as much as it recognized her own bravery. The transformation wasn't immediate. Sarah continued to struggle with feelings of guilt and unworthiness, particularly during quiet moments when her mind would drift back to that night in Afghanistan. But gradually, with the support of Admiral Harrison and the ship's counseling staff, she began to see her experience from a different perspective. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after their initial conversation, during a ceremony to honor fallen service members on Memorial Day. The entire crew had gathered on the flight deck to pay their respects to those who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. As the chaplain read the names of sailors and Marines who had died in recent conflicts, Sarah found herself thinking about Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim in a new way. Instead of focusing on her perceived failure to save them, she began to consider how they would want to be remembered. She thought about Rodriguez's infectious laugh and his stories about his family back in California. She remembered Thompson's dedication to physical fitness and how he had helped train newer Marines when they arrived at the base. Kim had been the quiet one, but also the most reliable, always the first to volunteer for difficult assignments, and the last to complain about harsh conditions. As the ceremony concluded and the crew began to disperse, Sarah made a decision that had been building in her mind for weeks. She approached Admiral Harrison, who had been standing nearby during the service. "Sir, I think I'm ready," she said simply. Admiral Harrison understood immediately what she meant. They had discussed this possibility during their previous conversations, but he had wanted to ensure that Sarah was truly ready before taking such a significant step. "Are you certain?" he asked. "There's no pressure to do this if you're not completely sure." Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the metal through her uniform shirt. "Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim deserve to be honored, and I think the best way I can honor them is by accepting that what I did that night mattered, even if it wasn't enough to save everyone." 2 weeks later, the USS Enterprise held a special awards ceremony on the flight deck. While such ceremonies were common on naval vessels, this one was unique because it was being held to formally recognize an award that had already been presented 3 years earlier. Admiral Harrison had worked with Personnel Command to ensure that Sarah's Bronze Star was properly reflected in her service record, but more importantly, he wanted to give her the opportunity to receive the recognition she deserved in front of her current shipmates. As the crew assembled in dress uniforms, Sarah stood at attention alongside several other sailors who were being recognized for various achievements. But while the others were receiving new awards, Sarah was there to finally accept an honor she had already earned, but had never been able to fully embrace. When Admiral Harrison called her forward, Sarah's steps were steady and confident. The weight of the medal against her chest no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a connection to the 3 Marines, whose memory she carried with her everywhere she went. "Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez," Admiral Harrison announced to the assembled crew, "is being recognized today for extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy of the United States while serving at Forward Operating Base Chapman, Afghanistan. Her exceptional courage and dedication to duty under extreme combat conditions resulted in the successful defense of a critical position and saved numerous American lives." As he pinned the Bronze Star to Sarah's dress uniform, Admiral Harrison spoke quietly so that only she could hear his words. "Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim would be proud of you. You've honored their sacrifice by learning to accept your own courage." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in 3 years, they were tears of healing rather than guilt. As the crew applauded and the ceremony concluded, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had carried for far too long. In the months that followed, Sarah's approach to her naval service began to change in subtle but significant ways. While she maintained the same high standards and work ethic that had always characterized her performance, she no longer felt the need to punish herself through excessive overtime and isolation from her shipmates. She began participating in the social activities that were an important part of shipboard life, forming friendships with other sailors, and allowing herself to enjoy the camaraderie that military service could provide. She also began speaking with newer sailors about her combat experience, sharing lessons learned and helping them understand the realities of military service in a way that their training exercises couldn't fully convey. Her willingness to discuss difficult topics and her obvious expertise made her a valuable mentor to younger service members who looked up to her experience and professionalism. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah began writing letters to the families of Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim. She had avoided contact with them for 3 years, afraid that her survival somehow diminished their loved one's sacrifice. But with Admiral Harrison's encouragement, she reached out to share her memories of their sons and to let them know how their courage and dedication had inspired her to become a better sailor and a better person. The responses she received from those families were more healing than anything else in her recovery process. Instead of blame or resentment, they expressed gratitude for her service and for her willingness to honor their son's memory. Several family members told her that knowing their loved ones had served alongside someone like her gave them comfort and pride. As Sarah's second deployment aboard the USS Enterprise neared its end, Admiral Harrison reflected on the transformation he had witnessed in the young sailor. The broken, guilt-ridden woman who had collapsed in the ammunition bay had become a confident, capable leader who wore her medal with appropriate pride while never forgetting the sacrifice it represented. On their last evening at sea before returning to port, Admiral Harrison found Sarah at the same observation deck where they had first spoken months earlier. She was wearing her dress uniform, preparing for the homecoming ceremony that would take place the following day, and the Bronze Star was prominently displayed among her other decorations. "How are you feeling about going home?" he asked, joining her at the rail. "Different than I did 3 years ago," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "When I left Afghanistan, I felt like I was running away from something. This time, I feel like I'm returning to continue something important." "And what's that?" Sarah smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the lights of their home port were beginning to appear. "Serving with honor, not just for myself, but for Rodriguez, Thompson, and Kim, and for all the other service members who depend on people like us to do our jobs with integrity and courage." As the USS Enterprise sailed toward port, Sarah Martinez stood proudly at the rail, her bronze star catching the reflection of the setting sun. She had learned that true courage wasn't the absence of fear or guilt. It was the willingness to continue serving despite those feelings, to honor the fallen by living up to the standards they had set, and to find meaning in survival by using it to help others. The medal she had hidden for 3 years now served as a bridge between her past and her future, a reminder that heroism wasn't about being perfect or saving everyone. It was about doing your duty when it mattered most, even when the cost was higher than anyone should have to pay. In finally accepting her Bronze Star, Sarah had not only honored her own service, but had found a way to carry the memory of her fallen comrades forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. Admiral Harrison watched her with satisfaction, knowing that the Navy was better for having sailors like Sarah Martinez serving in its ranks. Her journey from guilt to acceptance had not only healed her own wounds, but had made her a stronger leader and a more effective mentor to the next generation of service members who would follow in her footsteps.